My name is Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
It was on an unremarkable Thursday morning that the village of Chipping Cleghorn awoke to a peculiar kind of anticipation, though most of its inhabitants could not at first have put a name to it. The day itself broke without distinction. The air was damp but not unpleasantly so, with a faint mist lifting from the meadows beyond the high street. Cottages stood in their usual patient order, gardens neat, hedges trimmed, roses still lingering stubbornly despite the steady creep of autumn. Nothing outwardly suggested that change or disruption loomed. The shops opened at their customary times, the milk cart made its rounds, and the postman carried his leather satchel with the rhythm of one whose path seldom varied. Yet it was in the newspaper, folded crisply, printed with the day's small dramas and ordinary accounts, that something most extraordinary appeared. The Gazette had long been the lifeline of village gossip, disguised under the formality of local journalism. Its reporters covered fetes, garden shows, cricket scores, the births of babies, the deaths of old stalwarts, and the occasional scandal when someone's son in the city was caught in financial difficulties. Its most read section was not the solemn articles on council debates or the editorials on farming subsidies, but rather the small, neat column of announcements, engagements, sales, church meetings, whist drives, and the like. This Thursday's paper, however, contained a notice that instantly stirred the imagination of every reader who came upon it. A murder is announced and will take place at Little Paddocks Friday, October 29th. At 6:30 p.m., friends, please accept this. The only intimation. That was all. No flourish, no signature, no hint of humor save for the startling audacity of the words themselves. It stood out starkly between a notice of a jumble sale and a reminder of choir practice, as though it belonged no less to village routine. Yet, of course, it did not belong at all. The first to read it was Mrs. Swettenham, who received her paper with the early delivery and always unfolded it with her morning tea. Her son Edmund, lounging at the breakfast table with the air of one permanently disinclined to useful employment, looked up sharply when she let out a startled exclamation. "Good heavens, Edmund. Just look at this." She passed the paper across the table with the tip of her finger pressed against the announcement. Edmund read it aloud with a chuckle that was equal parts amusement and cynicism. "A murder announced. At Little Paddocks, no less. That's Lettie Blacklock's house. How quaint. Some sort of practical joke, I suppose." His mother frowned. "I don't see why anyone would consider it amusing. Printing such things. It's in the Gazette, Edmund. They don't usually print nonsense." "The Gazette will print anything if it's paid for," Edmund replied lazily. "Likely some clever dick idea for a party game. Amateur theatricals, perhaps. You know Lettie entertains a good deal. It's probably an invitation of sorts." Mrs. Swettenham was not wholly reassured. She had lived long enough to know that oddities seldom meant nothing at all, and though she was not of a naturally imaginative temperament, something in the bare phrasing of the notice struck her as chilling. Still, she folded the paper again, keeping the matter at the forefront of her mind even as she carried on with her day. Elsewhere in the village, other households discovered the same unsettling lines. At the vicarage, young Mrs. Harmon read it aloud to her husband. The Reverend Julian Harmon, whose preoccupation with parish finances left him slow to absorb the oddity. "Really? Darling, do you suppose it's in bad taste?" she asked, frowning prettily over her toast. "Or perhaps it's some kind of advertisement. But for what, a film? A play in Milchester, maybe?" Reverend Harmon, lost in the figures of the Church Restoration Fund, murmured something indistinct, leaving his wife to puzzle alone until she decided the whole thing must be harmless. Still, she made a mental note to mention it to her friends when they next met. At the village shop where the papers were collected a little later in the morning, tongues wagged with greater vigor. Dora Bunner, spinster and longtime companion of Letitia Blacklock, had the shopkeeper read it aloud for her eyesight was no longer keen. Dora gasped at once, her hand clutching the counter for support. "At Little Paddocks? But that's Lettie's house. Why, it says so plain as anything. I must hurry back and show her. She won't have seen it yet. Oh dear, what a dreadful thing to put in the paper." The shopkeeper, Mr. Totman, reassured her. "Now don't you upset yourself, Miss Bunner. It'll be a game, nothing more. Miss Blacklock's well known for her hospitality. Perhaps she's arranging some new amusement for you all." But Dora Bunner shook her head. She was not a woman given to invention, But her nerves, never steady at the best of times, told her this was no game. She gathered her purchases and set off, fluttering and fussing down the lane toward Little Paddocks. By noon, the village had been thoroughly infected with curiosity. In the post office, in the grocer's, at the butcher's shop, and even outside the railway station where commuters alighted, the words of the announcement were repeated, examined, laughed over, or whispered with a thrill of unease. Children were sent running to buy extra copies of the Gazette, so that their mothers might have proof to show to neighbors. In parlors and kitchens, the notice was read aloud again and again, as though the bald print might reveal hidden meaning with repetition. At the heart of all speculation lay one woman, Letitia Blacklock of Little Paddocks. She was a figure of dignity in the village, a woman past middle age, sensible, kindly, and with a comfortable fortune that allowed her to maintain her home and take in companions. Her household was an odd one, consisting of Dora Bunner, 2 young cousins, and a boarder of somewhat eccentric character. But Letitia herself was held in respect, and the notion that her house should be named in so strange a connection as a murder announcement was astonishing to all. By the time Letitia herself read the paper, brought to her by the eager hands of Dora Bunner, she was not altogether surprised. Visitors had already called at her gate with sly remarks, and the maid had reported hearing giggles from children loitering outside the fence. Letitia scanned the notice with raised brows and a composed expression. "Well," she said at last, "it seems we are to be the entertainment of the week. I expect half the village will descend on us tomorrow evening to see what comes of it." Her calm tone soothed Dora slightly, though the older woman still wrung her hands. "But laddie, it's such a horrid thing to say. Murder, I don't like it at all. Suppose it isn't a joke." "Suppose, my dear Dora," Letitia interrupted gently, "if someone intended to murder me, they would hardly advertise it in the newspaper first. No, it's nothing more than a silly jest. Still, if people do come, we must be prepared to receive them. Let us make sure there is tea and perhaps a little sherry." Thus she dismissed it, though in her heart she felt the faintest twinge of unease. Not that she would have admitted it. A woman in her position must show composure, and so she did. Word spread quickly that Letitia had taken the matter with good humor, and this only added to the excitement. By afternoon, there was little talk of anything else in Chipping Cleghorn. The grocer's boy carried tales from one end of the village to the other, while the ladies who met for needlework speculated in whispers. Some insisted it must be an advertisement for a new detective novel. Others said it was a coded message for spies. A few declared it in very bad taste, but even they could not resist reading it aloud once more. By evening, it was firmly decided in most households that they would attend Little Paddocks the following day. After all, it would be rude not to. If it was a party, one would not wish to be absent. If it was a joke, one would not wish to miss the punchline. And if, by the most unlikely chance, it was something serious, then surely one must witness it. The stage was thus quietly set, the villagers moving about their ordinary routines with an undercurrent of expectation, like actors awaiting the curtain's rise. Lamps glowed warm in cottage windows. Supper was served. The high street fell to its habitual silence. Yet all through the village minds returned again and again to the same words in black print, words that seemed to carry a chill of forewarning. A murder is announced. The following morning in Chipping Cleghorn broke with the same deceptive calm that had wrapped the village the day before. Nothing seemed altered in the crisp October air. Yet beneath the ordinary chatter of sparrows and the hum of kettles boiling in kitchens, a restless undercurrent ran like an unseen current in the riverbed. Every household that had read the Gazette now carried the notice within them, turning it over in thought, drawing new speculations with each glance, as though the simple black letters contained hidden depths if only one stared hard enough. Letitia Blacklock herself was at breakfast when Dora Bunner once again fretted aloud about the matter. Dora's nerves had not been soothed by sleep. She had spent much of the night imagining footsteps on the gravel, sinister shadows beneath her door, and 1,000 dreadful possibilities that her timid mind could conjure. Now, pale and fluttering, she pressed her toast into uneaten crumbs upon her plate and looked imploringly at her hostess. "Oh, Letty, really, I think we ought to cancel it, whatever it is. To let people come when something so dreadful has been printed. What if it turns out to be real? What if someone does mean harm? I shouldn't like you to take such risks, not in the least." Letitia sipped her coffee calmly, eyes steady on her companion. She was a woman of firm presence, her hair touched lightly with gray, her expression dignified without being cold. "Dora, you worry yourself into a fever over shadows. I've told you already it is nonsense. Whoever placed that notice had mischief in mind, nothing more. If we make a fuss, we shall only appear ridiculous. Better to take it with good humor. And since people are certain to arrive this evening, it would be ungracious not to offer them some hospitality. I will speak to Mitzi about preparing the sitting room." At the mention of Mitzi, their fiery young maid-of-all-work from Central Europe, Dora groaned softly. Mitzi was ever suspicious, quick to see danger in every corner, and the prospect of her hearing about the announcement filled Dora with dread of hysterical exclamations. But Letitia had already risen, smoothing the napkin from her lap with finality, and so the matter was closed for the moment. Meanwhile, the villagers had begun to shape their day around the anticipated evening. At the Swetnam house, Edmund laughed once more at the idea and made sarcastic comments about provincial excitement, though inwardly even he was curious. Mrs. Swetnam, caught between disapproval and a thrill she would not admit to herself, wondered what one ought to wear to a gathering that might or might not be a performance, a party, or, though she dared not finish the thought, something more sinister. At the vicarage, Mrs. Harmon whispered of it to her friends who stopped by, eyes bright with the delicious scandal of it all. The Reverend, reluctantly pulled from his paperwork, agreed that it would be proper for them to attend if invited. After all, if his parishioners gathered in one place, it was his duty to show pastoral concern. Yet he could not help a frown when his wife insisted it might all be quite fun. By midday, conversations in the high street were dominated by one topic only. People asked one another if they planned to go, if they thought it was a charade or something serious. A few half-serious wagers were made in the shop about whether the evening would end in laughter or police intervention. None, however, could resist the pull of curiosity. As the hours slipped by, that curiosity deepened into a strange sort of collective anticipation, the way a theater audience waits for the curtain to rise, each person restless yet unwilling to leave their seat. The village seemed to hold its breath. Even those who scoffed outwardly at the announcement, declaring it vulgar, silly, or an advertising gimmick, nonetheless made arrangements to attend. And if they pretended their decision was casual, they could not disguise the quickening of their hearts each time they recalled the precise hour, 6:30. At Little Paddocks, the preparations continued with an odd mixture of practicality and suppressed tension. Mitzi complained furiously in the kitchen, declaring that she would not stay in a house where murder was promised in print for all to see. She muttered darkly of conspiracies, of enemies who would come with guns, of terrible plots against innocent people. But when Letitia gave her a sharp look and reminded her of wages and duty, Mitzi subsided into sulky silence, banging pots with unnecessary vigor. Dora Bunner followed Letitia about the house like a nervous shadow, wringing her hands, now and then whispering her fears. The younger cousins, Julia and Patrick, treated the whole thing as an amusement. They teased Dora mercilessly, speculating in hushed tones whether the murderer would leap out from behind the curtains or whether a poisoned cake would be served with tea. "Patrick, do stop it," Julia snapped at last, though her laughter betrayed that she too felt the infectious excitement. "Poor Dora will have hysterics, and then where will we be?" "Don't fuss, old girl," Patrick replied, grinning. "It'll be splendid sport. The whole village will be here, gaping like fish. If someone jumps about in a mask, they'll have a story to tell for weeks." "Stories are all very well," Dora quavered, "but I don't like it. I don't like it at all. Murder is nothing to joke about." "Suppose it's real?" Letitia's steady voice cut through their chatter. "That's enough, all of you. We shall do nothing more than welcome our guests, whomever they may be. We'll have lamps lit, tea ready, and seats arranged. When the appointed time comes, we'll see for ourselves whether this is foolishness or something more." Her calm decisiveness silenced them, though it did little to soothe Dora's trembling. The clock ticked steadily through the long afternoon. Outside, the mist of morning had lifted, replaced by a chill brightness, the kind of autumn sunlight that turns hedgerows gold and makes shadows seem longer than they are. Neighbors paused in their gardens or leaned over gates to remark how fine the evening promised to be, while each silently thought of the gathering ahead. As twilight descended, lamps glowed in cottage windows earlier than usual, curtains were drawn, and more than one villager, adjusting their hat or coat, wondered again what awaited them. Would there be laughter, Would the whole thing end with Letitia offering cakes and declaring it had been a joke all along? Or, though none spoke it openly, would something dreadful happen in the quiet drawing room at Little Paddocks? By 6 o'clock, the lane leading to the house was busier than it had ever been on an ordinary evening. Couples walked briskly, neighbors grouped together, the sound of feet crunching on gravel mixing with low voices that carried both nervous laughter and excitement. The doorbell at Little Paddocks rang more times in half an hour than it usually did in a week. Mitzi, muttering darkly about the foolishness of it all, admitted them with brusque curtsies while Dora fluttered anxiously, showing guests into the sitting room. Letitia received them with composed courtesy, offering chairs and making small remarks as though it were indeed nothing more than a social gathering. Julia and Patrick moved among the guests with youthful ease, while the room gradually filled with the hum of voices. Everyone kept glancing at the clock, trying not to seem as though they were doing so, yet aware of each minute that ticked away. At 6:20, the air in the room had shifted. Laughter had grown forced, conversation scattered into fragments, and even the most skeptical among them found their ears straining for a sound outside the door, their eyes flicking toward the windows. Dora's breathing was quick and shallow, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles whitened. Mitzi hovered in the doorway, scowling. Letitia sat upright, calm, though her eyes too moved toward the mantel clock where the minute hand crept inexorably onward. At 6:30 precisely, the lights went out. The sudden darkness drew a collective gasp, followed instantly by startled cries. Chairs scraped against the floor, someone dropped a glass that shattered, and in the confusion came the unmistakable sound of a door opening. A harsh voice, loud and commanding, rang through the room. "Stick 'em up!" Hands in the air. A blinding flash of torchlight swept across startled faces, dazzling eyes, and before anyone could comprehend, the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. The room was a tangle of confusion. Voices raised in alarm, the acrid tang of gunpowder clinging to the air even as the darkness pressed like a shroud. Someone stumbled against a chair. Another cried out in fright, and then came the thud of a heavy fall. The torchlight, still slicing the blackness in quick, jolting arcs, seemed to dance on faces twisted in fear. Then, with a suddenness that felt almost deliberate, the torch beam faltered, a final gunshot cracked, and silence fell. For a breathless moment, nothing moved save for the uneven gasps of those who had thrown themselves flat or crouched against the walls. Then, as though released from a spell, the voices returned in a clamor of alarm. "Mitzi! Mitzi, where's the switch? The lights." Letitia's voice, surprisingly calm, cut through the babble. Someone, perhaps Julia, groped toward the door, and with a clatter the lights blazed back into being. The scene they revealed was one that none present would forget for as long as they lived. Near the door lay the intruder, a young man, his figure crumpled unnaturally on the floor, a revolver still clutched in his slack hand. His body was twisted at an angle that spoke of finality. His face, half in shadow, bore the stunned expression of one who has been caught mid-action, frozen forever at the moment of violence. Gasps and cries filled the room. Mrs. Swettenham clutched her son's arm, white to the lips. The vicar's wife raised her hands in horror. Patrick gave a low whistle, half in awe, half in disbelief, while Julia's sharp intake of breath betrayed her shock despite her composed exterior. Dora Bunner, trembling so violently that she seemed near collapse, clung to Letitia's arm, and Letitia herself. She stood upright, a line of blood glistening where a bullet had grazed her ear. The scarlet streak was small, but in the lamplight it appeared vivid, a startling contrast to her pale face. She pressed a handkerchief to it with remarkable composure, her eyes moving steadily over the scene before her. The first instinct of the villagers was a strange mingling of awe and unease. For many, the overwhelming thought was that the announcement had been real, that they had come expecting a game, only to be thrust into a deadly seriousness. Others, shaken, muttered that it must still be some terrible joke gone wrong, though none could say how. Edmund Swettenham was the first to break the silence. "Well, I'll be damned. It looks like he meant it. A real revolver, a real corpse. Charming evening entertainment." His voice, though flippant, carried an edge that betrayed his unease. "Quiet, Edmund," his mother hissed, though her own voice trembled. The Reverend Harmon bent down cautiously beside the fallen man. He touched the wrist with the hesitance of one who half expected a pulse. Then he shook his head gravely. "He's gone," he said softly. "There is no life here. The words fell with the weight of finality. Mitzi, who had hovered by the door, let out a piercing scream and fled into the passage, muttering frantically in her native tongue. Dora whimpered like a child, clinging tighter to Letitia. Julia looked toward her cousin Patrick, who returned her glance with something unspoken in his eyes. "Police," Letitia said firmly, in the manner of one accustomed to decision. "Someone must fetch Inspector Craddock at once. Patrick, you and Edmund go at once. Tell him what has happened. Say there has been a shooting here." Patrick gave a low grunt, glancing once more at the body on the floor. "Right you are, Aunt Letty." He and Edmund moved swiftly toward the door, though not without a glance of morbid curiosity at the dead man. The rest remained where they were, uncertain, staring at the body as though afraid it might rise again. Time seemed to slow, the tick of the mantel clock loud in the strained silence. Some tried to resume seats, others stood rigid, unable to look away. Letitia alone appeared steady, her handkerchief still pressed calmly to her wounded ear. It was not long before the sound of a motor approached outside, and then the hurried tread of heavy boots along the garden path. Inspector Craddock, broad-shouldered and businesslike, entered with 2 constables close behind. His eyes swept the scene with a practiced gaze, taking in the dead man, the gun, the shaken guests, and the composed figure of Letitia Blacklock at the center of it all. "What's all this, then?" he demanded, voice brisk. "A man shot? Who fired? Who is he?" A chorus of confused replies rose, overlapping, until Letitia raised her hand for quiet. "Inspector," she said evenly. "This man burst into the room while the lights were out. He shouted threats and fired. When the lights came on again, he was lying as you see him now. None of us here fired upon him. He seems to have been killed during the struggle, perhaps when his own weapon discharged." Craddock's brow furrowed. He knelt beside the body, examined the revolver, the position of the limbs, the blood. One of the constables bent low to assist, while the inspector straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. "We shall see about that. But first, the man's identity. Does anyone here know him?" There was a murmur of uncertainty. Then Julia spoke hesitantly. "I think I may have seen him before." "Isn't he the foreign chap from the garage?" "Rudi Scherz?" Several heads nodded in recognition. A few muttered that they had seen him about. A foreigner who had done odd jobs and was not much trusted. "Rudi Scherz," Craddock repeated, his eyes sharpening. "A petty crook, if I'm not mistaken. Fraud, blackmail, forgery. So, what was he doing here, brandishing a revolver in a lady's drawing room?" No one answered. Dora gave a soft moan. Mrs. Swettenham fanned herself nervously. The vicar cleared his throat but found no words. Craddock's gaze swept the room once more, measuring each face in turn. "Ladies and gentlemen, I shall need statements from every one of you. Not one of you is to leave until we have them. In the meantime, this house is to be considered a scene of crime. Whatever you may think, this is no amateur dramatics. A man has died here tonight, and I mean to know why." The weight of his words settled upon them all, and for the first time the gathering truly understood that they were witnesses not to a game, but to a murder. Each face bore its own version of shock, fear, or feigned indifference. And behind them all, quiet and watchful, the thought of the strange notice in the Gazette hovered, unanswered and ominous. Miss Marple, who had come to the gathering in unobtrusive fashion and had kept herself in the background during the evening's events, now shifted slightly in her chair. Her sharp blue eyes observed the scene with a mildness that belied the keenness of her thoughts. She had not spoken yet, nor drawn attention to herself, but within her mind, threads were already forming, weaving small details together into the beginnings of a pattern. She alone, perhaps, felt the first stirrings of what the notice had truly meant, and what shadows might still lie ahead for Little Paddocks and those within it. Inspector Craddock wasted no time in asserting control over the uneasy gathering. His manner was brisk, but his voice carried a tone of measured authority that made even the more excitable among them fall into subdued silence. The constables busied themselves by sealing off the room, one standing firm at the doorway to ensure no one came or went. The body of Rudi Scherz lay where it had fallen, a grim reminder that no amount of nervous laughter or speculation could wish away the reality of what had transpired. A smear of blood had begun to seep slowly across the carpet, and Dora Bunner gave a small whimper each time her gaze strayed toward it, forcing Letitia gently to steer her attention elsewhere. Craddock asked for calm and order before he began to take statements. Each villager, each guest, was to tell what they had seen when the lights went out, what they had heard, and what they recalled of the moments before and after the shooting. His notebook emerged, and his pencil moved with quick, firm strokes as he recorded their words. Mrs. Swettenham was the first to attempt a coherent account, though her voice quavered. She insisted that she had been seated beside Dora Bunner when the lights failed, that she had heard a man shouting, "Stick 'em up," in a foreign accent, and then the shots, 3 or 4 of them in quick succession. She could not be certain whether the first came before or after the intruder's command, but she recalled the sound of glass breaking and someone gasping nearby. Edmund, her son, added with sardonic detachment that the fellow had blazed in like an amateur in a second-rate film, that the torchlight had been wielded theatrically, and that the whole thing had been ridiculous except, of course, that the man was now very much dead. Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, wrung her hands and said she had been quite certain she would faint. She had clutched her husband's arm and closed her eyes, hearing only a barrage of noise. The Reverend, grave and methodical, stated that he had tried to discern what was happening but had been unable in the darkness. The only fact he could affirm was that the intruder had shouted, that shots followed, and that the man fell almost instantly. The younger people, Julia and Patrick, both claimed they had barely seen more than blinding flashes. Julia's voice was steady but subdued, and her eyes shifted once or twice in Patrick's direction as though silently agreeing on the tone of their responses. Patrick, on the other hand, could not conceal his excitement. He described it all with a curious mixture of relish and bravado, insisting that he had half expected it from the start. Craddock frowned at his flippancy, though the boy's manner suggested nothing more sinister than youthful arrogance. Dora Bunner's statement was the least coherent, delivered between nervous tremors and fluttering breaths. She clutched at Letitia's sleeve while insisting she had seen nothing at all, only heard dreadful noises and felt certain she would die of fright. Letitia herself was precise and unflustered, explaining that she had been seated near the hearth when the man burst in, that she had seen the flash of the torch, then felt the bullet graze her ear before the chaos broke out. Her calmness impressed Craddock, though he noted her words carefully. It was when Miss Marple spoke almost apologetically that Craddock felt the prickle of something different. She had been seated somewhat in the background, as was her habit, knitting in her hands at the time of the announcement. In the dark, she had sat very still, listening as she always did more than she looked. Her account was simple. She had heard the command, noted the harsh timbre of the voice, and thought it sounded forced, as though the man had been playing a part rather than issuing a genuine threat. The remark drew a sharp glance from the inspector, though Miss Marple hastily added that it was only an impression, nothing she could swear to. Still, Craddock wrote it down, and in the way his pencil pressed the page one could sense he thought it worth remembering. When all had spoken, the inspector straightened and surveyed them with a steady gaze. "Very well. It is clear enough that this fellow, Shirts, burst into the room with a gun and shouted as though he meant to rob you all. He fired, and in the struggle that followed he was killed, most likely by his own weapon. That is the immediate appearance. But I tell you plainly, ladies and gentlemen, things are rarely so simple. I shall have my men make inquiries. In the meantime, I must ask that none of you leave the district until I say otherwise. You are all witnesses in a matter of violent death." A murmur rose, subdued but uneasy. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others glanced toward the door as though longing for escape. Craddock continued, his tone firm. "You may go home tonight, but you will all be called upon again tomorrow. This house will remain under supervision until the body is removed. Letitia Blacklock, I must commend your composure, but you must allow my men to search the premises before we are done here." Letitia inclined her head with calm dignity. "Of course, Inspector. Whatever is necessary. You will find there is nothing in this house to concern you." The gathering broke up slowly after that, the villagers departing with subdued murmurs, each pausing to glance once more at the still form of the intruder as they passed. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, and whispers carried along the lane as neighbors departed in clusters, already retelling what they had witnessed with fresh embellishments. The stars overhead shone clear and cold, indifferent to the turmoil below. Back within the house, quiet fell again once the last of the guests had gone and the constables had settled to their tasks. Dora Bunner was near to collapse, her nerves stretched to breaking. Julia coaxed her gently to bed, while Patrick wandered restlessly from room to room as though eager to boast of the evening's adventure. Mitzi shut herself in the kitchen, muttering angrily that she would not stay another night in a house where murder had been promised and delivered. Only Letitia sat quietly in the drawing room, her handkerchief still stained with the blood from her ear, her expression thoughtful. Miss Marple, unnoticed for the moment, remained in her chair, her knitting idle upon her lap. Her eyes moved from the hearth to the doorway, from the shattered glass upon the floor to the position where the body had lain, now removed. In her mind she replayed the voices, the sequence of sounds, the quality of the silence in those black seconds. She thought of how the man's command had seemed almost rehearsed, and of the oddity of announcing a murder in print before attempting such a crime. She thought, too, of Letitia's composure, and of the way Dora's terror seemed not merely the nervousness of a fluttering woman, but as though she had felt herself in very real danger. Inspector Craddock, returning briefly to collect a few final details, caught sight of the quiet elderly lady and gave her a half-smile of recognition. He had seen her before at village gatherings, though he knew little of her. Yet something in her calm presence struck him as unusual among so much agitation. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you? From St. Mary Mead?" he asked politely. "Yes," she replied with modest nod. "I am staying here with my friend Mrs. Harmon for a few days. It is very extraordinary, Inspector, don't you think? To print such a notice in the paper and then for this to happen exactly as written." Craddock's eyes narrowed slightly. "Extraordinary indeed, ma'am. I don't like it at all, and I mean to get to the bottom of it. If you should notice anything at all, I hope you'll let me know." Miss Marple smiled gently, her gaze still resting upon the scene. "Oh, Inspector, I dare say it will all come clear in time. But I have learned that little things are often most important. A slip of speech, a mannerism, something quite ordinary that shows what lies beneath. I shall certainly tell you if I think of anything." With that, the inspector took his leave and Miss Marple returned to her knitting. But her mind was far from idle. Already the seeds of suspicion were planted, and though she did not yet know what form the truth would take, she sensed that the death of Rudy Schertz was not the end of the matter. On the contrary, it was only the beginning, and the real danger still hovered over Little Paddocks like a shadow, waiting its moment to strike again. And as the village of Chipping Cleghorn settled uneasily into its beds that night, hearts quick with the memory of gunshots and blinding darkness, none could shake the feeling that the announcement in the Gazette had been more than a prank or a grotesque performance. It had been a warning, a promise, and perhaps even a challenge. The true meaning of it was still veiled, but before long the veil would be torn aside. The autumn sun struggled weakly through a veil of thin cloud the following morning, painting Chipping Cleghorn in pale light that did little to dispel the heaviness hanging over the village. The church bell marked the hours in solemn tones, each strike reminding the inhabitants that time moved forward, even when hearts and minds lingered behind. Caught in the memory of gunshots, a lifeless body sprawled on the carpet, and the disturbing knowledge that someone had promised a murder and kept the promise. In every home, conversation turned inevitably to Little Paddocks. The butcher's wife recalled how she had once seen Rudy Schertz loitering in the high street and thought him shifty. The postmistress declared that she knew from the start the whole business was peculiar. The villagers, as Miss Marple well understood, were doing what villages always did, building their own narrative, seeking order in the chaos, reshaping fear into speculation. At Little Paddocks, the atmosphere had shifted from shock into a strained imitation of normal life. Letitia Blacklock maintained her household routine with admirable determination, insisting that meals be served at their regular hours, that Dora Bunner take her rest in the afternoons, that Julia and Patrick carry on with their engagements. Mitzi clattered noisily in the kitchen, complaining that death hung about the house like a curse while Julia silenced her with sharp words that carried more bite than sympathy. Patrick laughed too loudly, his jokes brittle, his restless movements betraying nerves he could not quite disguise. Dora fluttered like a trapped bird, clinging to Letitia's side, and it was only Letitia's quiet authority that kept her from dissolving entirely into panic. Inspector Craddock returned mid-morning, determined to continue unraveling the tangled skein. His men had traced Rudy Schertz's background a little further. A small-time clerk in Montreux, once dismissed for petty dishonesty, later a hotel receptionist, with no known ties to anyone in Chipping Cleghorn. His acquaintances described him as eager, impressionable, often desperate for money. Why such a man should appear in a quiet English village armed with a revolver remained an unanswered question. Craddock, however, was not inclined to accept coincidence. The inspector sat once more in Letitia's drawing room. The household gathered reluctantly around him. His questions were sharper this time, his gaze more probing. He pressed Julia on her movements during the blackout. She responded crisply, too crisply, saying she had remained in her chair and heard only the intruder's voice. He questioned Patrick about the revolver. Patrick scoffed, remarking that it looked like something dragged out of a museum, and insisted he had never touched it. Dora's voice wavered as she repeated her conviction that someone had brushed past her in the dark, but she could not say who. Mitzi grew wild, declaring that she had heard whispers in the kitchen days earlier, though when pressed, she contradicted herself, and her tale dissolved into a muddle of suspicion and grievance. Letitia herself answered each query with calm precision, her gaze steady, her words clear. She admitted to no doubts, no memory of any hand but her own moving when the lights went out. No suspicion beyond the obvious. Craddock, studying her closely, could not decide whether her composure was the natural result of a strong will or the practiced mask of someone concealing more. After the interviews concluded, Miss Marple lingered in the corner of the room, her knitting idle in her lap. She had spoken little, yet her eyes had never ceased their quiet movement from face to face, watching each reaction, each flicker of expression. When the inspector rose to leave, she accompanied him to the gate, her step unhurried but purposeful. "Inspector," she said softly when they were out of earshot, "forgive me if I speak out of turn, but I think you should not dismiss poor Dora Bunner's fear. She may seem fluttery, but sometimes those who appear weakest are the most sensitive to danger. She believes someone meant to harm her, and I do not think she is mistaken." Craddock frowned. "But why her? She's hardly of importance." Miss Marple's eyes rested upon him with quiet patience. "It is often those who seem least important who see or know something they should not. Perhaps she reminds someone of another, or perhaps she is in the way of something larger. In any case, her fear is real. Do not disregard it." The inspector nodded reluctantly, sensing again the depth of her insight. "I'll bear it in mind, Miss Marple. And you'll keep your eyes open, I imagine." She smiled, her needles resuming their gentle click. "They are open, Inspector, always." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Harmon household. Mrs. Harmon, delighted with her guest, fussed about with tea and cake, while the vicar gravely discussed the moral implications of violence intruding upon their quiet community. Yet Miss Marple's mind wandered as she listened, her thoughts circling around the peculiar details of the case. Why had the announcement been made at all? What was its purpose if not to terrify and confuse? Why had Scherz been the one to die, rather than one of the household? And most curious of all, why had Letitia Blacklock remained so unnervingly calm? Her reflections were interrupted when Mrs. Swettenham arrived, eager for company and more eager still to repeat the latest village speculations. She leaned forward confidentially, lowering her voice though no one else was near enough to hear. "My dear Miss Marple, it is obvious that young Patrick knows more than he says. I saw him the other night looking very queer indeed. And that Julia, well, she's far too cool for my liking. Mark my words, there's something fishy about them both." Miss Marple murmured polite acknowledgments, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, but in her mind she tucked away the observations. Gossip, she knew, often distorted the truth, but within its distortions there was sometimes a kernel worth saving. The following days brought subtle shifts in the household at Little Paddocks. Dora Bunner grew increasingly fragile, her nerves frayed to breaking. She confided to Miss Marple in a trembling voice that she feared she would not live long. Julia grew impatient with her fluttering and snapped more than once, while Letitia remained unshaken, always ready with a soothing word. Patrick carried on with his careless jokes, though his laughter rang hollow. And Mitzi, perpetually muttering about unseen threats, insisted one evening that she had overheard someone moving about the house in the dead of night. None took her seriously, but Miss Marple's eyes sharpened at the tale. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, pursued his inquiries with methodical persistence. He sought to understand why Rudy Scherz had chosen Little Paddocks. Who had he been in contact with? Why had he believed a staged robbery would succeed in such a setting? The answers eluded him, each clue dissolving into smoke when he tried to grasp it. Yet he felt more and more certain that the truth lay within the Blacklock household itself. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, came to the same conclusion. She had seen enough in her long years to recognize the signs, the subtle undercurrents between members of a household. the glances too quickly averted, the remarks that carried more weight than their speakers realized. She did not yet know where the threads would lead, but she felt the pattern forming beneath her fingers as surely as she felt the wool pass through her needles. One evening, as she sat in her small guest room at the Harmons, she reflected on the story Dora had told her, that she had felt herself brushed in the dark, that she had been certain death was meant for her. Miss Marple considered carefully. If Dora was right, then Schurz had not been the true target. Someone else had intended to use the confusion to remove a harmless old lady. But why Dora, unless... Her needles clicked steadily as her thoughts spun. Unless Dora had stumbled upon something she did not understand, something that placed her in quiet danger. Miss Marple's eyes grew sharper. She had seen it before. The most unassuming people dismissed as foolish or fluttery, who by chance glimpsed some truth others wished to remain hidden. If Dora had noticed something, however trivial, it might be enough for someone to wish her silenced. The thought lingered with Miss Marple as she extinguished her lamp and settled to bed. Outside the night lay still, but within Little Paddocks shadows moved unseen. Somewhere in the heart of that household truth waited, dark and dangerous, biding its moment to strike again. And Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human weakness, knew with a cold certainty that the affair at Little Paddocks was far from finished. Rudy Schurz had been only the first victim. The game, carefully plotted, was still in motion, and before it ended, another death would darken the village of Chipping Cleghorn. The morning after the inquest dawned pale and muted, as though the village itself had drawn in its breath and decided to speak in whispers. Clouds hung low over Chipping Cleghorn, casting the little cottages in soft shadow, their chimneys releasing thin tendrils of smoke that curled upward and dissolved in the stillness of the air. Miss Marple, already awake and seated by her small bedroom window, knitted steadily while her eyes surveyed the world outside. There was nothing hurried or nervous about her. If anything, she seemed at ease. Yet beneath the mild expression and the measured movements of her hands, her mind was turning quickly, weaving threads of knowledge and observation into a careful tapestry. The events of the past days had left her neither startled nor alarmed. She had seen such things before, though not always in so genteel a setting. What troubled her now was not the fact of a death, tragic though it might be, but the way it had unfolded. An advertisement for murder in the village gazette, a gathering of neighbors at Little Paddocks, and then the sudden intrusion of a man with a gun, ending in his own demise. The official explanation, though neat, sat uneasily upon her. People she knew did not arrange their exits so clumsily. Something was hidden behind the curtain of this performance, and she had no intention of letting it remain obscured. By mid-morning, she was making her way down the neat garden path of her lodging, her walking stick tapping lightly against the stones. She was not headed for any particular appointment, but rather into the rhythm of the village, where conversations at hedgerows and in shops often yielded more truth than a policeman's ledger. She began at the grocer's, greeting Mrs. Finch with a kindly smile. The talk, as Miss Marple had expected, soon turned to the murder. People were unsettled, fearful even, though they masked it with chatter about butter rations and the price of tea. Miss Marple listened, not merely to the words, but to the tones, the pauses, and the glances exchanged. One detail, casually dropped by a woman purchasing flour, caught her attention. The woman claimed she had seen a figure near Little Paddocks earlier on the day of the murder, lingering at the gate before slipping away when noticed. She dismissed it as a tradesman lost on his way, but Miss Marple's mind tucked it carefully away. If true, it suggested planning, a deliberate watching of the house before the appointed hour. Leaving the grocer's, Miss Marple wandered to the post office. Here the air was thick with speculation. Mrs. Harmon was in earnest discussion with another villager, insisting that Letitia Blacklock had appeared far too calm during the tragedy. Others defended her, pointing out that Miss Blacklock had narrowly escaped death herself. Again, Miss Marple did not engage, only listened. People revealed more when they believed themselves unobserved. And what she gathered was not merely gossip, but glimpses into character, resentments, loyalties, and old wounds resurfaced by the violence of recent days. Her next stop was at the vicarage, where she found Bunch Harmon arranging flowers in a vase. Bunch, with her open and straightforward nature, welcomed Miss Marple warmly and soon poured out her anxieties. She worried for Miss Blacklock, worried for the whole village. "It feels," she said, "as though something dark has crept into our lives, and none of us know quite where to look for it." Miss Marple comforted her gently, remarking that darkness often came not from without, but from within familiar walls. Bunch shivered, uncertain whether to laugh at the remark or take it as a warning. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Inspector Craddock, weary-eyed and methodical, appeared at the tea shop where Miss Marple had settled herself. He acknowledged her with a brief nod, perhaps aware that her quiet presence in the village had already yielded more insight than he could collect through formal questioning. He sat opposite her, ordered tea, and after a moment of silence asked if she had formed any impressions. She smiled faintly and said only that people were rarely what they seemed, and that in her experience murder was almost never as straightforward as it first appeared. Craddock leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There are inconsistencies, you know. The weapon was brought to the house, but how? And why announce the crime beforehand, unless it was meant as misdirection?" He shook his head. "I'll find the answer in time. But these villagers, they talk in riddles," Miss Marple replied softly. "They talk as people always do, half in truth, half in concealment. One must know how to distinguish the two." She did not press her knowledge further, preferring instead to let Craddock underestimate her. She knew already that her greatest strength lay in being overlooked. In the following days, Miss Marple observed quietly. She noted the way Miss Blacklock spoke when visitors offered sympathy, grateful yet distracted, as though her mind wrestled with some unspoken concern. She noticed Dora Bunner's nervous attempts at reassurance, clinging tightly to her friend as if to ward off invisible danger. She saw Mitzi, the maid, trembling with fear whenever the subject of the murder arose, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. Fear, yes, but not the fear of the crime itself, more the fear of being questioned, of being exposed. Miss Marple's reflections deepened when she heard that Miss Blacklock had received another anonymous note. This one slipped through the letterbox. It contained only a few words, cryptic, threatening, and no signature. The village buzzed with the rumor, but Miss Marple wondered if the note was not meant for Miss Blacklock at all, but rather for those around her. Such gestures often served multiple purposes: to intimidate, to confuse, or to misdirect suspicion. One evening, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to take supper at Little Paddocks. The house, though comfortable, seemed to her full of unease. Lamps glowed in the drawing room, casting long shadows across the walls. Miss Blacklock, though hospitable, appeared strained, her usual composure fractured by sudden starts whenever the floor creaked or a door closed unexpectedly. Dora Bunner prattled nervously, eager to fill silence with chatter. Mitzi hovered like a restless spirit, her eyes darting suspiciously from one guest to another. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she let her gaze wander over the room, noting the placement of furniture, the arrangement of lamps, the small details others might overlook. She imagined again the night of the crime, the sudden darkness, the crack of the gun, the confusion. Details began to settle into place, though the full picture was still elusive. But she felt, with the certainty of instinct, that the truth was woven into this very room, hidden in plain sight. The evening drew to a close, and Miss Marple returned to her lodging beneath a sky now clear and bright with stars. Her mind, however, did not rest. She replayed every word spoken, every glance exchanged. The murderer, she was convinced, walked still among them, cloaked in ordinary manners, their guilt concealed by the very familiarity of village life. The advertisement, the gathering, the performance of violence, it was a stage, and the play had only just begun. When at last she laid her knitting aside and prepared for bed, she murmured softly to herself that patience was the key. Evil revealed itself not in haste, but in the quiet cracks of human behavior. And she, more than anyone, knew how to listen for those cracks. The night passed without event, but the sense of foreboding lingered over Chipping Cleghorn like a veil. And Miss Marple, in her quiet room, knew with absolute certainty that the murder had not yet fully spoken its story. The next morning rose damp and gray, a low mist clinging stubbornly to the hedgerows and drifting languidly over the quiet lanes of Chipping Cleghorn. The air itself seemed reluctant to move, as though the village lay under some enchantment, hushed and expectant. Miss Marple, as was her habit, had risen early. She sat near the window of her modest room, her knitting in her lap, though her hands moved less than usual. Her attention instead fixed upon the softened outlines of the world outside. Something in the atmosphere struck her as curiously significant. She could not say what exactly. Perhaps it was the oppressive stillness, Or perhaps it was simply that events had reached a point where the ordinary rhythm of life felt strained and unnatural. The murder had, of course, left its mark upon every household. Faces that once greeted one another with warmth now betrayed unease. Conversation stumbled into awkward silences when speculation grew too bold. And beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed currents of fear and mistrust, swirling invisibly between neighbors. For those who had been present in Little Paddocks on that fateful evening, the experience was sharper still. It was not merely a crime reported in the Gazette, but a memory engraved upon their nerves. They had seen the flash, heard the gun, smelled the acrid smoke, and they carried that night with them in every gesture, every guarded glance. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people, when frightened, reveal themselves most clearly. A frightened person will blurt or protest too much or attempt an alibi no one has asked for. She had begun to sort these little slips in her mind like puzzle pieces. Letitia Blacklock, for instance, maintained her composure, but carried about her the faint air of one guarding a secret too heavy to lay down. Dora Bunner clung to her friend's side with dog-like devotion, though her chatter betrayed unease more than comfort. The maid Mitzi continued to quiver at shadows, which Miss Marple suspected had less to do with the gunman and more to do with her own private history. And the others, Patrick, Julia, Philippa, each wore their masks well. Yet Miss Marple had never met a mask that did not crack under scrutiny. The day unfolded with deceptive normalcy. At the baker's, women queued for their loaves, speaking in low voices of the inquest and of Inspector Craddock's inquiries. At the post office, letters changed hands, but eyes lingered on one another, measuring, questioning. At the vicarage, Bunch Harmon moved restlessly about her duties, her natural cheer dampened by the continuing sense that evil had brushed too near. And through it all, Miss Marple listened. She was too experienced to rush her conclusions. A story as tangled as this one required patience. Threads had to be followed, no matter how fine, until they revealed the pattern. By mid-afternoon, she found herself once more at Little Paddocks. The invitation had been casual. Miss Blacklock had suggested tea, a gesture of normality in a time that felt anything but normal. The house seemed outwardly serene, its garden still carefully tended, its rooms warm with the glow of lamps. Yet Miss Marple could not help but feel the unease that hovered in its air. She noticed the faint tremor in Miss Blacklock's hands as she poured, the nervous laugh of Dora Bunner as she recounted an inconsequential memory, and the sharp darting eyes of Mitzi as she hovered in the doorway. Conversation turned, inevitably, to the crime. Miss Blacklock spoke of it with the weariness of one who longs for peace but finds none. She expressed relief that the danger seemed past, yet Miss Marple detected in her tone something curiously unresolved, as though relief were a cloak pulled too tightly around her shoulders. Philippa, seated nearby with her embroidery, remarked that she could scarcely believe the incident had been real, so theatrical it seemed in hindsight. Patrick and Julia, lounging carelessly, offered irreverent quips that drew reproachful looks from Dora. Their levity felt forced, the laughter brittle. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, let the words wash over her without appearing to study them. She asked no direct questions, yet her ears caught every hesitation. Her eyes registered every shift in expression. One moment in particular struck her deeply. When Mitzi, pressed to recount again what she had witnessed that night, grew defensive. She insisted she had seen clearly, that she knew what she knew, but her voice faltered at a crucial point. She glanced toward Miss Blacklock, almost as though seeking permission, or perhaps fearing reprisal. The silence that followed was telling. Miss Marple stored it away, another piece to be fitted in later. That evening, as twilight gathered over the village, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly back to her lodgings. She did not hurry, for her mind was occupied. She thought again of the strange advertisement, of the assembled company, of the sudden violence. She thought of the note that had arrived afterward, the one meant to unnerve. She thought of Mitzi's fear, of Dora's anxious devotion, of Miss Blacklock's steady but strained demeanor. And she thought most of all of the peculiar coincidence that had drawn them all together on that night. Coincidence, Miss Marple knew, was rarely innocent. Later, as she settled before her fire with her knitting, she reflected on the lesson life had taught her countless times, that murder did not spring from the air like a storm. It grew from roots long buried, roots that twisted through old grievances, hidden relationships, secret envies. To uncover the murderer was to uncover those roots. And she was certain, though she could not yet name the hand that had fired the gun, that she was drawing nearer to the truth. The village clock struck 9, its chimes echoing faintly across the fields. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and murmured softly into the quiet of her room. Evil, she said to herself, is rarely content with a single act. It seeps, it spreads, it waits to strike again. And until it was named, revealed, and uprooted, no one in Chipping Cleghorn could truly rest. And so she resolved that the following day she would begin anew, not with blunt questions but with the quiet, unassuming conversations that had always served her best. Somewhere within those conversations lay the key, and she meant to find it. The following morning brought with it an uneasy brightness. The mist that had lingered the day before had burned away, leaving the village exposed under a pale autumn sun that seemed too stark, too sharp, for comfort. Miss Marple, seated by her breakfast tray with her knitting at hand, reflected that the deceptive clarity of the weather matched the state of affairs in Chipping Cleghorn, everything visible, yet the truth still obscured, like a photograph developed too brightly, blinding the viewer to the fine details. She took her tea slowly, thinking over the conversations of the previous evening, her sharp eyes narrowing as certain recollections repeated themselves in her mind. There was something she had not fully seen, though she had heard it clearly enough. Often, she reminded herself, what was most important was not what people said, but what they avoided saying. Her decision that morning was firm. She would take a more deliberate step in her inquiries, though without, of course, appearing to inquire at all. She had learned long ago that the gentlest prod, masked as idle interest, could open more doors than any direct interrogation. The villagers, unsettled though they were, would talk as they always talked, to pass the time, to relieve their nerves, or simply because silence felt too heavy to bear. And Miss Marple, in her soft-voiced way, would listen and remember. Her first call of the day took her to the vicarage, where Bunch Harmon greeted her with the mixture of affection and relief that Miss Marple always seemed to inspire. Bunch was not clever in the calculating sense, but she possessed a warm honesty that made her both endearing and useful. Over tea and scones, Bunch spoke of her worries. "It isn't only that someone was killed," she confessed, lowering her voice, though the house was empty. "It's that someone here among us, someone we pass in the lane, someone we nod to at church, planned it. And if they planned once, what's to stop them from planning again?" Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand gently. "You are quite right to be uneasy, my dear. Murder rarely comes in isolation. It is like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples spread outward, touching shores one never expected." She let her words hang there, watching as Bunch shivered faintly at the image. Later, as Miss Marple made her way down the lane toward the shops, she found herself intercepted by Dora Bunner. Dora, flustered and eager to unburden herself, insisted on walking beside her. She spoke in hurried whispers of her dear friend Letitia, of how the strain was affecting her health, of how dreadful it all was. She hinted, quite without intending to, that Miss Blacklock had grown nervous about papers, about documents locked away in a bureau, about something which Dora herself did not understand, but which plainly troubled her friend. Miss Marple listened, nodding sympathetically, while inside her mind a small flame of certainty sparked. Documents, papers. There was often a trail of truth to be found in such things, and it was seldom one that murderers could fully conceal. The afternoon brought a more subtle revelation. Miss Marple visited the shop of the local dressmaker under the pretext of mending a sleeve. While pins and fabric were discussed, the talk turned, as always, to the crime. The dressmaker, eager for importance, whispered that she had heard from the maid of another household that Mitzi had once been overheard arguing with Miss Blacklock. The quarrel had been about wages, or so it was said, but there was something sharper beneath it, something that made the dressmaker lean closer and murmur that perhaps Mitzi knew more than she dared admit. Miss Marple tucked the gossip away, not as fact but as a reflection of how the maid was perceived, and perception, she knew, could be as dangerous as truth. By evening she was once more at Little Paddocks. The house held a peculiar tension, as though every object within it were aware of unseen eyes. Miss Blacklock was polite, yet her hospitality seemed strained, her hands twitching when she poured the tea. Dora, fluttering beside her, filled the air with nervous chatter, while Mitzi hovered near the door, stiff as a sentinel. Patrick and Julia sprawled in apparent carelessness, their youth shielding them from the deeper gravity of events, but their glances were quick, assessing. Philippa, as usual, kept her composure, her quietness perhaps too perfect, like glass that revealed nothing beneath. As conversation faltered, Miss Marple ventured a gentle remark. "How curious it is," she said softly, "that such a thing should have been foretold and in print no less. An advertisement placed openly and yet none took it seriously. I suppose that was the cleverest part." Her voice carried no accusation, only wonder, yet her eyes, keen and deceptively mild, watched every face as the words settled in the room. She saw Miss Blacklock's jaw tighten ever so slightly, Dora's eyes widen with fresh unease, Mitzi's lips press thin, and Philippa's needle pause in midair. It was only a heartbeat silence broken at once by Patrick's mocking laugh, but Miss Marple noted it with the care of one adding a vital stitch to her knitting. That night, in the privacy of her lodging, Miss Marple allowed herself to review her growing suspicions. She had gathered enough threads to see the outline of the tapestry, though the colors were not yet filled in. There was deception here, and misdirection as surely as there had been smoke and darkness on that night. The murderer had relied on confusion, on the assumptions of others, and on the natural inclination of people to believe what was simplest. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing human frailty, knew that the simplest explanation was often the cleverest disguise. She set down her knitting and folded her hands. The path ahead would be delicate. One must not accuse too quickly, for a cornered criminal was like a trapped animal, unpredictable and dangerous. No, the truth must be revealed with care, with patience, and with a keen awareness of the small betrayals people made without realizing. And so she resolved that the following day, she would test her theory not by confrontation, but by a quiet arrangement of circumstances, a little stage of her own making, in which the guilty would find themselves speaking more than they intended. Outside, the village lay in silence, the cottages darkened, the air cool with the promise of frost. Yet within Miss Marple's room, the light of the lamp glowed warmly, and in her eyes there shone the clear certainty of one who, though not yet ready to name the murderer, had already begun to see the shape of evil behind the mask. She murmured, as she reached to extinguish the lamp, "It will not be long now." No, not long at all. And with that quiet assurance she slipped into sleep, leaving the night to hold its breath, waiting for the next turn in a story that was far from finished. The morning after her quiet resolution, Miss Marple rose with the same measured patience that had always defined her days. Yet there was a glint in her eyes that betrayed her sharpened sense of purpose. She moved about her room with habitual care, setting aside her knitting, adjusting her shawl, and ensuring that her small basket was prepared should she need to step out into the village. The air outside was crisp, with a faint bite of frost that silvered the hedges and rooftops. Chipping Cleghorn looked deceptively serene beneath the pale sunlight, but beneath that serenity lay an undercurrent of unease that no villager could quite ignore. Miss Marple began her walk with no particular haste, greeting those she passed with her usual politeness, and yet each exchange served as another subtle observation. She could not help but notice that conversations grew hushed when she approached, and resumed in lowered tones after she had moved along. Fear, she reflected, had a way of binding people together even as it pulled them apart. Every household seemed drawn into the web spun by the murder, each person wondering whether their neighbor's smile concealed knowledge or guilt. Her first stop was the post office, where the air smelled faintly of ink and damp envelopes. Mrs. Swettenham was there, busily exchanging remarks with the postmistress. She had an animated manner, her words tumbling over one another. But beneath the bustle, Miss Marple detected the nervousness of a woman eager to disguise her own curiosity as civic duty. "It's dreadful," Mrs. Swettenham was saying, "positively dreadful. An advertisement of all things. And the poor man dead, shot before our very eyes, and now Inspector Craddock digging into everyone's affairs as if we were criminals ourselves." She laughed a little too quickly. Miss Marple, smiling gently, made no contribution beyond a mild remark about the chill in the air, but her mind noted the way Mrs. Swettenham's eyes darted, as if fearful of hearing her own name drawn into speculation. From the post office, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage. She found Bunch Harmon in the garden, pruning a rose bush with unnecessary vigor, her cheeks flushed from both cold and suppressed agitation. The moment she saw Miss Marple, Bunch set down the shears and hurried forward, her words tumbling out in anxious urgency. "It doesn't feel right, Miss Marple. I keep thinking, what if it wasn't finished that night? What if whoever planned it has something more in mind? I can't help but worry for Miss Blacklock. She seems so very fragile, and yet she puts on such a brave face." Miss Marple reassured her in her gentle way, though her own mind lingered on Bunch's words. It was precisely that thought which had been troubling her, that what they had witnessed was only the beginning, a single stroke in a longer, darker design. The advertisement, the dramatic intrusion, the apparent suicide of the gunman, it was a performance carefully staged, but the true purpose of the performance had yet to reveal itself. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple accepted another invitation to tea at Little Paddocks. The atmosphere there was strained, though every effort was made to appear otherwise. Miss Blacklock sat with composed dignity, but her hands trembled as they lifted the teapot. Dora Bunner fluttered nervously about her, speaking in bright, brittle tones that betrayed the effort it cost her to maintain composure. Mitzi moved stiffly, her eyes ever watchful as though expecting an accusation to fall upon her at any moment. Patrick and Julia lounged together, their voices light, yet their laughter carried the faint note of self-consciousness. Philippa, as always, worked quietly with her needle, but her silence was more eloquent than speech, for it seemed deliberately maintained. It was during this visit that Miss Marple observed something which lodged itself firmly in her thoughts. While Dora Bunner chattered about trifles, she let slip a remark about Letitia's birthday, quickly corrected by Miss Blacklock with a sharpness that surprised the room. The correction was trivial on the surface, but Miss Marple's instinct pricked at once. People were rarely so quick to defend themselves against inconsequential slips, unless there was more at stake. It was a moment that passed almost unnoticed, save for the quiet weight it carried in Miss Marple's mind. When the evening drew to a close and Miss Marple returned to her lodging, she sat before the fire and considered carefully all she had seen. The pattern was forming more clearly now, though it remained incomplete. There was something about identities, about relationships concealed or obscured, about a history that was not what it seemed. The murder was not merely an act of violence, but the eruption of something long buried. That night she slept lightly, and when morning came, she rose with renewed determination. She knew that she must press a little further now, for time was not her ally. The murderer had acted once and might act again, perhaps more desperately if they suspected discovery was near. To wait too long was to risk another life, and Miss Marple had no intention of allowing that if she could prevent it. Her plan, then, was simple but effective. She would continue her quiet inquiries, her seemingly harmless conversations, but she would also begin to test the people involved, gently and without warning. A casual remark, a sudden question, a pointed silence, these were her tools, and she wielded them with the precision of one who had spent a lifetime studying human weakness. She would lay her small traps of words and watch who stumbled, who faltered, who revealed themselves more than they intended. The day unfolded with the same deceptive calm that had characterized so many days since the murder. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. Evil often dressed itself in the clothing of the ordinary, and as she walked once more through the familiar lanes of Chipping Cleghorn, she thought quietly to herself that the time was drawing near when the mask would slip, when the truth would break through the careful fabric of lies, and when it did, she meant to be ready. The evening shadows lengthened across Chipping Cleghorn, softening the sharp edges of the cottages and blurring the tidy lines of the gardens. Lamps flickered on in windows, casting small islands of light into the growing darkness. To anyone unacquainted with the undercurrents of unease, the village might have seemed peaceful, even idyllic. Yet Miss Marple knew well enough that beneath that surface calm lay something far more dangerous. The murderer had not finished their work, of that she was certain, and the longer the truth remained concealed, the greater the peril for all who lingered at Little Paddocks. She sat quietly by her fire, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Her mind moved carefully over each detail, each remark she had heard, each expression she had observed. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but they were beginning to align into a pattern that only she, with her quiet patience and uncanny insight, could see. She thought of Dora Bunner's slip of the tongue about Letitia's birthday, of Miss Blacklock's sharp correction, of the trembling hands and guarded eyes of those who lived under that roof. Such details might appear insignificant to the casual eye, but to Miss Marple they whispered of truths that someone was desperate to keep hidden. The following morning she walked again to Little Paddocks. The air was heavy with damp, a fine mist hanging low over the hedgerows. Miss Blacklock greeted her with outward politeness, though the strain of recent days was etched deeply into her face. Dora Bunner flitted about in her distracted way, eager to be useful but succeeding only in muddling things further. Mitzi moved like a watchful shadow, muttering under her breath in her thick accent, her fear palpable. Patrick and Julia were together as always, their laughter just a little too quick, their glances toward one another just a little too rehearsed. Philippa, pale and silent, bent her head over her work, but her quietness suggested more than shyness. It was the quiet of someone who carried a private burden. Miss Marple joined them for tea, her manner as mild and unassuming as ever. She listened far more than she spoke, allowing the conversation to swirl around her. Dora chattered about her memories of school days with Letitia, her voice fond and wistful, until Miss Blacklock cut her short with an abruptness that startled even herself. A silence fell, broken only by Patrick's forced laughter as he steered the talk elsewhere. Miss Marple sipped her tea and let her eyes rest briefly, almost casually, on Miss Blacklock. In that moment she saw the flicker of fear, swiftly concealed, that confirmed her growing suspicion. This woman was guarding a secret far greater than anyone suspected. Later, when Inspector Craddock arrived, his face grave with the weight of responsibility, Miss Marple slipped quietly into conversation with him. He was inclined toward facts, toward evidence that could be catalogued and measured, and he had a natural impatience with speculation. Yet he had begun to respect the quiet wisdom of the elderly lady who so often seemed to notice what others overlooked. Miss Marple spoke softly, suggesting that the inspector look more closely at the relationships between those in the house, not merely their statements. "You see, Inspector," she said gently, "people rarely reveal themselves in what they tell you. They reveal themselves in what they are careful not to say." That evening brought a new disturbance. Dora Bunner, flushed with excitement, insisted on recounting once more the events of the fateful night, embellishing her story with every telling. She grew so animated that she spilled a little tea upon her sleeve. Mitzi muttered sharply about clumsiness, and Julia, with a roll of her eyes, went to fetch a cloth. It was in this moment of small confusion that Miss Marple observed another telling detail. Miss Blacklock, distracted by Dora's chatter, dropped her knitting and bent swiftly to retrieve it. The movement exposed a faint scar on her neck, quickly concealed as she adjusted her collar. The others noticed nothing, but to Miss Marple the sight was like the turning of a key in a lock. A scar such as that could not be ignored. It spoke of a past injury, perhaps one connected to a history long hidden. As the days wore on, Miss Marple drew nearer to the truth, though she revealed nothing of her thoughts. She understood the danger too well. A murderer who sensed discovery would strike again, and likely without hesitation. Instead, she continued her gentle probing, her careful watchfulness. She made a point of visiting Mrs. Swettenham, of conversing with Bunch Harmon, of calling upon Philippa in her quiet corner of the garden. Each visit provided another thread, another clue to the tapestry that was slowly taking form. One evening, as the village gathered once more at the vicarage for a meeting, Miss Marple sat silently while others spoke of trivialities, their nervousness betrayed in the too bright tone of their laughter. She let her gaze wander, taking in the faces around her, and suddenly, in the midst of the ordinary chatter, she saw it. The fleeting glance exchanged between two people, the tightening of lips, the stiffening of posture. It was no more than an instant, but it was enough. She knew in that moment that her suspicions had been correct all along. The murderer was not who they seemed, and the truth lay hidden not in the violence of that night, but in the long, tangled history of inheritance, identity, and deception. When she returned home, Miss Marple did not sleep. Instead, she sat long into the night, the fire burning low, piecing together the final threads. She thought of the advertisement, the staged drama, the gunman's death. She thought of birthdays and scars, of slips of the tongue and sharp corrections. She thought of the way fear clung to Little Paddocks like a shadow. And by the time the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, she had reached her conclusion. She knew who had planned it all, who had killed to protect a secret, and who would kill again if left unchallenged. But she also knew that timing was everything. To reveal the truth too soon would invite another desperate act. To wait too long would risk another life. She must choose her moment with care, and she must be ready when it came. Thus the stage was set for the final act. The villagers went about their daily lives, whispering their fears behind closed doors, while in the quiet of her lodging, Miss Marple prepared herself for the confrontation to come. The murderers still believed themselves safe, hidden behind layers of deception, but Miss Marple knew the mask would soon fall. And when it did, there would be no refuge left for them, no excuse strong enough to hide the truth. The web of lies was drawing tighter, and at its center stood a figure who had thought themselves untouchable. They had underestimated the quiet old lady with her knitting and her gentle smile. Soon, very soon, they would learn their mistake. The night had grown still. The village hushed as though it too waited for something to break the silence. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room at Little Paddocks, her hands folded neatly upon her lap, her eyes bright and steady as she regarded those gathered there. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his notebook closed but his presence firm, the weight of authority lending strength to the room. Around them the household lingered in restless unease. Patrick fidgeting with impatience, Julia her gaze sharp but anxious, Philippa pale and withdrawn, Mitzi muttering nervously, and Miss Blacklock seated rigidly in her chair, her expression carefully schooled but betraying the flicker of strain beneath. Miss Marple spoke quietly, her voice no more than a thread of sound, but it carried in the stillness. She began with the advertisement, with the bizarre notion of announcing a murder before it occurred. It seemed at first a childish prank, she said, but it was far too carefully designed for that. It was, in fact, a perfect cloak, an event that would gather witnesses, confuse the issue, and allow a death to pass as accident rather than deliberate crime. Her eyes rested upon Miss Blacklock. And you, my dear, were meant to be the victim, or so it appeared. The lights went out, shots were fired, and the intruder fell dead. But the true purpose was not to kill you at all. It was to mask the fact that you were already in danger of exposure. Someone here was not who they claimed to be. There was a stir in the room. Dora Bunner, poor soul, had spoken too freely, dropping hints that pointed toward a truth long concealed. That Letitia Blacklock, the lady of the house, had not been the woman who inherited the fortune. The real Letitia had died years before, quietly and without fanfare. And the woman who sat before them now was in truth Charlotte, her younger sister, who had lived much of her life hidden from society, marked by a scar upon her throat from a childhood illness. Miss Marple's voice softened, yet her words struck with precision. You took your sister's place after her death because in her name lay a fortune. Few could tell you apart, and those who might, like poor Dora, were either too loyal, too blind, or too easily silenced. But when word came that the heirs to the estate might seek confirmation, you feared exposure. The announcement of a murder gave you the chance to divert suspicion and, if necessary, remove anyone who threatened to reveal the truth. Charlotte, posing as Letitia, sat very still. Her hands, once so composed, trembled slightly upon the arm of her chair. I had no choice, she whispered at last. All my life I had nothing, shut away, hidden, forgotten. And then, this chance. It was mine, if only I had the courage to take it. Her eyes lifted to Miss Marple, desperate, pleading. Do you not understand? I only wanted a life, a little dignity, a home. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sorrow. I do understand, she said gently. But murder, my dear, is never the answer. Lives have been taken, an innocent man used and discarded, Dora poisoned to silence her, and others put in fear of their own safety. No happiness can be built upon such foundations. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm as he declared Charlotte under arrest. There was no struggle, no outburst, only a long, shuddering sigh as the woman bowed her head, the mask finally fallen away. The others watched in silence, their faces pale, their relief tempered by the weight of tragedy. When at last the house grew quiet again, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire, her knitting once more in her hands. The click of the needles was steady, soothing, as though she had merely returned to her ordinary life. Yet her eyes were thoughtful, touched with sadness. She had seen such things before. Ambition curdled into desperation, love into fear, loneliness into crime. Human nature, she knew, was endlessly complex, and endlessly capable of both good and ill. Later, as she walked home beneath the starlit sky, the village lay peaceful around her. The great shadow lifted at last. There would be gossip, of course, endless talk over teacups and hedges, but in time even this would fade into the fabric of village life. Chipping Cleghorn would go on, much as it always had. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking back once more at the quiet street. Justice, she reflected, had been served, though it was a justice tinged with pity. She thought of Charlotte's trembling voice, her plea for understanding, and she sighed softly. "Poor soul," she murmured. "Poor foolish soul." Then she turned, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her, leaving the night to its silence. And so the case of the announced murder came to its end, not with triumph or applause, but with the quiet, steady certainty that truth, however painful, had been brought into the light, and that those who remained might now find peace.